This video is sponsored by Lighter Creative. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this past weekend saw the largest Warhammer 40k event of the season, with the Las Vegas Open moving to an October timeframe and competing in its slot with a lot of other huge events, including this one in around the same time frame. That event has shed a lot of players, and it looks like the London Grand Tournament has taken its spot as the largest event of the year. And this year, the London Grand Tournament was just over 1,000 players, and today we're going to be breaking down the top placing list, talking about the matchups that it played in order to get to its undefeated slot and exactly what makes this list tick. Now, very quickly, I think it's worth discussing the format of the event. The event did use a top cut format, so it played 5 rounds that were open to everyone. After that, if a player went 5-0 and qualified for the top 16, they played a shadow round, which got added to their additional 5 rounds, and then a second set of 4 single elimination games. So an additional 5 rounds, meaning that the winner of the London Grand Tournament in 2025 had to go 10 straight wins of Warhammer 40,000, an absolutely Herculean effort. And the player who did that this year was none other than Liam Vissel, who we have also seen win the last 2 consecutive London GTs. One of the most impressive players in Warhammer 40k, certainly in contention for the best player in the game, especially since getting multiple consecutive wins of one of the most prestigious tournaments in the world, and this year, the largest tournament. Now, the other thing is that Liam has done it repeatedly with mixed chaos factions, and he decided to take that again today. So let's hop over into his list just after a quick word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Lighter Creative. Now, I've already talked about Lighter Creative on this channel in the past, and their cool and innovative mats as well as WTC-compatible terrain systems. But what they want me to talk to you about today is their updates to their battle mat system. Now, Lighter Creative uses this vinyl-style battle mat. It's a textured material with a felt backing, which makes it super-duper nice on your tabletop. While this is lighter than neoprene, it comes with a ton of advantages, including the fact that it can be folded up rather than requiring it to be rolled, because it won't crack and smooths out really easily once you lay it out on the tabletop. Lighter Creative previously created battle mats that were compatible for use with Warhammer 40k, including printed deployment zones and objective markers, and I'm happy to report that they have expanded their selection of these styles of mats, now including new designs. However, they also now have mats that are compatible with multiple game systems. This one, for example, this is a Kelty mat. It's a little baby guy. That's pretty cool, right? They also have less sci-fi themed designs if you're looking for something that's compatible with more of a fantasy game. That said, the Warhammer 40,000 mats do have a ton of advantages. They retain those cool deployment zone and objective marker printouts, as well as including a measurement grid, now with marked sections on the battlefield, so you can actually see very easily where things like your deployment zones or table quarters actually line up. This looks like such an incredible improvement in play experience and makes it easier to score out your objectives, in addition to kind of looking like a battlefield overlay, which is kind of sweet. So check out these mats in the links in the video description if you're looking to grind games competitively. Now, in this case, Liam was playing a Veterans of the Long War detachment. Now, this is very rarely seen, but has a lot of really powerful tools for a strong player to utilize. So, while other detachments like Pact-Bound Zealots may do more damage, Renegade Raiders may have more speed and flexibility available to it, Veterans of the Long War does have a lot of tricks and skirmishing effects that you can use to confound your opponent in the early game. Now, the detachment ability itself gives you an ape of an Oath of Moment effect. You can choose an enemy unit in the start of your command phase, and your non-cultist models will get reroll hits against it. That unit becomes your focus of hatred, and many of your stratagems will also have additional effects when they target your focus of hatred. That includes, but is not limited to, fights first from Bringers of Despair when you are engaging your focus of hatred. In addition to that, you also have stratagems like Millennia of Experience, which gives you a reactive move, Contemptuous Disregard, which gives you an Armor of Contempt effect, and Let the Galaxy Burn, which gives you easy access to ignore cover. Now, in this particular case, it was electing to take Cypher in order to provide a lone operative character that can mess with opponents' stratagem usage, Fabius Bile, and a Chaos Lord. Fabius Bile was going to be joining into a 10-model unit of Chosen in most games. That allows him to apply his +1 strength and toughness leadership ability to the unit, then also provide several damage blanks to make them more difficult to kill. The Chosen baseline can advance and charge, so you have a little bit of extended threat range up the center of the table, and on top of that are very difficult to remove. You get to 0 damage out, 1 failed saving throw from Fabius Bile. In addition to that, the Surgeon Acolyte, the little additional model that comes with Fabius Bile, is an extra 1 wound miniature, which you can use to sack a big hit into as well. So you essentially get kind of 2 damage blanks, since the attendant model is not a character. From there, we also have a unit of cultists to control the backline objective and screen out the backline, a Legionnaire squad, which is likely going to be joining in with that Chaos Lord to give him wound rerolls. They gain wound rerolls when they take enemies on objectives, and he can use his Finest Hour once per game effects to improve his damage characteristic with his Devastating Wound Demon Hammer, making him a very powerful combat threat against heavy targets once per game. We have some utility provided by a unit of Chaos Bikers, a Nemesis Claw, which is another good piece of technology to fight against melee mirror matches. The big thing that this thing these guys let you do is prevent enemies from using stratagems on the unit they're engaging, which prevents them from doing things like using defensive stratagems to try to blank the damage from the Chosen unit that's bearing down on them. You can also stop them from interrupting in combat or doing other similar strats. Them alongside Cypher can really mess up opponent stratagem usage in the center of the table. So defensive stratagems, reactive moves, interrupts, anything that can mess with your game plan becomes very difficult to execute. And that just means that this list is able to continuously skirmish over that midboard without being disrupted by enemy effects. We have some backline shooting from 2 Predator Destructors just to provide some pretty solid gun platforms. Big thing here is that these guys are a relatively low AP characteristic. However, we can use Let the Galaxy Burn to grant them ignore cover. So the fact that the Predator autocannon on the top of these guys is only AP 1 is not that big of a deal if we are just applying ignore cover on top of it. We have 2 Chaos Rhinos to carry the Legionnaires, Nemesis Claw, and the Chosen to the fight to give them a little bit of a boost of speed when they disembark those transports and allow them to move up the table without necessarily being attacked by big guns. In the later game, these guys can also embark ranged units like the Noise Marine squad that's also in the army. These guys are going to be on loan from Emperor's Children, so they're coming directly out of the Emperor's Children Codex. And a big thing is that while they lose the Thrill Seeker's ability, so they no longer have the army ability from Emperor's Children, if they embark in that Rhino and use the firing deck off the Rhino retains Dark Pacts, which means you're able to fire Blastmaster shots from those Noise Marines, 2 sets of 3-shot, 3-damage weapons. Those will gain Dark Pacts, so if you turn one of those Rhinos into a gun platform after your melee units have committed and been delivered to the fight, the Rhino can then apply all of those buffs to the Noise Marines. The Noise Marines will get their rerolls innately, I should mention. They do get the Heretic Astartes keyword, but they don't innately have Dark Pacts. And those rerolls are going to synergize pretty well with Dark Pacts because rerolls alongside critical effects like lethal or sustained hits based on what you do Dark Pact for is hugely beneficial. You have more chances to roll those critical hits. On top of that, we have 2 units of Obliterators. These guys have a variety of weapon profiles that they can fire when they are selected to shoot. These are either sustained hit 1 strength 5 attacks, D6 blast 2 damage attacks, or D3 shot melta 2 heavy anti-tank attacks. Now, the big benefit that these guys have is their Warp Rift firepower. This gives them a once per battle ability to fire indirectly, and they have innate deep strike, which means it's very difficult to screen out that indirect fire. It's difficult to pre-measure their movement if they're just sitting in reserve. You'll have to screen out most of the table to stop the Obliterators from hitting you. The huge benefit here as well is that obviously indirect fire gets -1 to hit and caps its ballistic skill at 4, meaning it can never hit on, and caps its hit roll on a 4. It can never hit on better than a 4. However, you can re-roll that hit roll. So even if you are trying to remain out of line of sight, you are dodging the Predator Destructors, and you're trying not to get hit by the Obliterators, even if the Obliterators have to fire indirectly, they can fire at the Focus of Hatred target and offset a lot of the downside of firing those weapons through line of sight blockers, which means that it's basically impossible to hide from them. Essentially, there's nothing you can do to stop these guys from hitting you when the Chaos Space Marine player wants to. Now, last but certainly not least, we also have a really impressive brick here, a unit of 10 Warp Talons. Now, the Warp Talons are kind of synergistic with the Obliterators. The big benefit that Warp Talons have is their ability to enter in reserve after a fight phase in which they destroyed an enemy unit and are no longer engaged. So when these big unit of 10 Warp Talons, which attacks 40 times with twin-linked AP2 weapons, hits into something small, let's say 5 Space Marine Intercessors, there's almost very little chance that the Warp Talons will fail to kill it. And even if you hit something larger, you can use the combination of Dark Pact and rerolls from the Focus of Hatred effect to ensure that those Warp Talons convert against whatever they're hitting. And remember, we can also make it difficult for you to spend defensive stratagems with Cypher or with a Nemesis Claw present so that we can ensure that the Warp Talons get their kill. As soon as they do that, they're going to pop into reserve, be entirely immune from your opponent for the remainder of the round. Then, at the end of their movement phase, you're going to rapid ingress them back on the table, and they're going to try to repeat the process. If you can continuously do this, Warp Talons will slowly attrition your opponent's army into nothing. And when you're in a situation where Warp Talons can constantly be removing your light utility units, your screening units that you're trying to take the midboard and score secondary objectives with, the Obliterators can also hop in and target your larger units. So this army has a very unique ability. In the hands of a good player, which obviously its pilot is, you can hold up both this Warp Talon effect, the ability of the Obliterators to kill a unit once or to shoot once per game out of line of sight, and your reactive move next to your transports to effectively make it so that you can cleanly take pieces from your opponent in the early game for a round or two without them being able to reciprocate at all. The Obliterators are going to shoot from out of line of sight, the Warp Talons are going to kill something and leave, and you can throw a unit into melee and potentially engage another unit, force your opponent to fall back and trigger your reactive move back into a Rhino, or simply not kill the unit like Legionnaires or Chosen that you have just presented to them to attack. If your opponent isn't set up appropriately to deal with all of these individual threats, you can kill somewhere around 20 to 30% of their army without them even drawing line of sight to your units. And that is crazy. That's such an attritional lead that very few armies are going to be able to come back from that. And then on top of that, the army just has good sustained damage anyway. It has solid shooting from the Predators. The Obliterators, once they're on the table, use their indirect fire ability and just fire direct line of sight, as well as the Noise Marines, are all incredibly effective shooting. You have decent melee from the Chosen, plus the Legionnaires and the Nemesis Claw. So the army at a baseline is doing fairly well. However, it has this capacity to just play an uninteractive game that you can't deal with. And that's what makes it so effective. I also want to note here the importance of the terrain system in the construction of this army. The UKTC terrain layouts that were used at the event had a lot of these massive central ruins, a big 12-inch by 12-inch brick of line-of-sight blocking terrain that had an extension piece attached to it that blocked a lot of the lines of sight through the center of the table. That did a couple things to the composition of this army. The first thing is that it gave a great staging area for units like the Warp Talons and like the Chosen to post up in the middle or to sit behind Rhinos behind that extended area of terrain that then allowed them to reach the objectives across the edge of the table and push onto the opponent's either expansion objective or to threaten control of the middle objective. The other thing too is that obviously it incentivized the opponent to do similar things, which made the capacity to reach out and touch units that are doing that really important. So that further improved the lot of the Obliterators, where if your opponent is similarly trying to stage to threat in the middle of the table, you can defend yourself with reactive moves and fights first, but on the flip side, you can also just be choosing those units that are hiding there as your at the moment target, and then using your once per game indirect fire to just blast them for a turn and try to either pick up or weaken those units before you actually get into a fight with the very resilient Chosen brick. So the army's success with these units was very heavily impacted by the existence of these big terrain in the middle. Now, let's hop in and talk about exactly what the pairings were that Liam played over the course of his rounds. Early in the tournament, the list was paired against Tyranids, an invasion fleet piloted by Michael Glenwright. This list was very aggressively focused. It played a lot of Genestealers. It played some Maleceptors that could push the middle of the table. The Genestealers in the early game do have the downside of having to fight into that potential fights first ability, where if you have chosen them as the focus of hatred, without necessarily needing to have a good target in order to choose that focus of hatred, and those Genestealers try to commit into you, you can choose fight first, and Chaos Basement profiles are pretty good into Tyranid profiles. You're basically just going to wipe out half the unit or more before it gets to swing into you, and you're going to do very little damage. On top of that, a lot of the army is relatively squishy to a lot of the output that this Chaos Space Marine army has. Things like zoanthropes in this list that are trying to act as its anti-tank drop pretty quickly to Predator Annihilators. And the fact that the Tyranids are trying to use the Swarm Lord to get a bunch of additional command points to use a lot of extra stratagems. When fighting into things like Nemesis Claw and into Cypher, these effects that prevent you from using stratagems effectively, that means that this is going to be an uphill battle for these Tyranids, and they did go down. That moved on to round 2, where Liam played against Matt Bell, who was playing Adeptus Mechanicus. Now, this ended up being a 3-point game. The first game was a relatively competitive, but still Chaos Space Marine favored 90-73. However, round 2 ended up being 89-86, a ridiculously close finish. Matt here was playing a Skitarii Hunter cohort, which has incredible scoring potential. This included Belisarius Call, a Skitarii Marshal with Battlesphere uplink, and a ton of Taraxi and Sicarians. That is a grand total of 20 Sicarian Rust Stalkers and 20 Sicarian Infiltrators, followed up by 20 Taraxi Sky Stalkers and some shooting from Scorpius Disintegrators and Iron Strider Ballistari. Now, a lot of the damage output from this list comes from the backline shooting, all of those Iron Striders and the Scorpius Disintegrators. I imagine that the Chaos Space Marines are going to try as hard as they can in the early game not to be in line of sight from those guns. They don't really want to get into a trading match, I don't think, with these styles of ranged attacks. However, they do have to deal with all of the Sicarians, who are very difficult to kill and very aggressive. And while we did talk about how there is some counterplay to aggressive melee units in the Tyranid matchup, where you can pre-declare a unit as your focus of hatred and threaten it if it comes in to try to attack you in melee, that you're going to fight first and do a bunch of damage. However, this list not only has a threat overload of a ton of units that can do that, but also the Taraxi Skystalkers can steal your objectives away by just moving and shooting and scooting with their data sheet ability onto those objectives without having to charge. So there's no way for you to fight back during your own turn, and you just lose the points. However, that said, units like the Noise Marines are incredibly effective into armies like this that are mass medium infantry, like all these Sicarians. So there definitely is a lot of play. You also have those 2 damage blast attacks that are perfectly statted into Sicarian profiles from the Obliterators. So there's a lot of potential sweeping that we can bring to bear from this Veterans of the Long War list. However, you do have to fight through the baseline, incredibly strong scoring of these Skitarii Hunter cohorts, and so that is why we ended up with an extremely close game. Now, the next game was not quite as close. We played against Space Marines, which is an Ultramarine Stormlands Task Force, a pretty standard Stormlands Task Force that we've seen in the past, running Storm Raven gunships and Storm Speeders. The downside here, I think, is that both armies are essentially trying to play a very similar style, where they're trying to play this sort of skirmishing game plan with the ability to deep strike really high impact shooting from things like the Obliterators with rerolls into the Storm Raven gunship and the Dreadnoughts that are going to be taking up the center of the battlefield from the Stormlands Task Force. You do have the capacity to just sweep up that unit as well. On top of that, you have things like reactive moves and defensive abilities that the army is really relying on, and so having tools like Nemesis Claw and Cypher in order to prevent those from being used is another big benefit in the Chaos Space Marine favor here. So this ended up being a huge blowout of a game, 85-28. Following that up, we went to day 2 of the event, another relatively solid win that Liam was able to secure over Christopher Abbott and his Leagues of Votann. This was a Brandfast Oathband. Now, this attachment is kind of scoring focused, which is interesting. It did lose a lot of its efficacy in a recent FAQ. It used to have the ability to basically disembark its units whenever it wanted to out of its transports. That got restricted in the timing and the effectiveness of the stratagem, so you could no longer do that to mess up with your opponent. However, you can do it to sort of flip scoring and try to keep the score on your own side. This list was running 2 Ironkin Steeljack units alongside Hecatan land fortresses to benefit from all of the transport synergies that they have. I'm not sure if the Ironkin Steeljacks really have like what it takes here to compete with the Chaos Space Marines in melee, especially once they start messing with your stratagem use. Not to mention the fact that a lot of what you're trying to do is sweep them off objectives without controlling the objectives yourself. So their yield point mechanic, where they try to steal objectives from you or retain control of those objectives in order to generate yield points, and get their army abilities is a little easy to play around. Things like Warp Talons, being able to go in, clear an objective of enemies, and then return into reserve. So there's not only nothing for you to charge and engage on that objective, but you're also not holding the objective is a bit of a disaster for Leagues of Votann. And that moves us on to a World Eaters matchup. It had a total of 40 Khorne Berserkers, including a Juggernaut Lord with Battle Lust to give him the additional movement bonus that he provides the Khorne Berserkers, as well as charge bonuses. So we have this huge unit of Khorne Berserkers that can advance and charge, push super duper far up the table, and just absolutely vaporize whatever it hits. However, again, it's another situation where you can potentially be holding up fights first, especially being able to like re-engage with a Nemesis Claw and then prevent your opponent from using -1 damage or combat interrupting makes your melee matchups super duper duper hard. And especially again, if we can present situations where the Chaos Space Marine army is not trading pieces with the opposing army, it's simply taking them. It's using the Warp Talons to go in and kill a unit, the smaller units like 8-bound Jackals or Chaos Spawn, and then returning them into reserve and then repeating them the next turn means that you're not giving the World Eaters army anything to engage into. What they want to do is force up their utility units into the center of the table and then force you to come kill them and then counterattack, basically use that additional momentum from charging and pile in and consolidate moves to then swing their Berserker units into your army, turn it into a scrum, and absolutely ruin you from there. However, this army not only disincentivizes you from charging aggressively, but also has the capacity to kill those units without giving charge targets to the World Eaters, which can make it very advantaged in a situation like this. And that ended up being an 83-46 win for Chaos Space Marines. Now, from there, we went into Nassim Fouchain. That's Fouchaini, another incredibly strong player rocking Space Marines, and this time he was running Raven Guard in a Shadow Mark Talon. Now, I will mention that the UKTC, the UK tournament circuit that the London GT is part of, did rule that the Raven Guard detachment, as well as the other special Space Marine detachments, do not gain the additional Oath bonus from the data slate update. So they do not gain +1 to wound on their Oath. So we're playing the slightly less powerful version of Shadow Mark Talon. Now, this detachment has a lot of play into these kinds of armies that are trying to simply play a standoff game in the early game because they have the capacity to redeploy themselves so aggressively that they can simply force the fight on their own terms, which I'm sure has made this a very difficult matchup for the Chaos Space Marines. Now, that said, they do have to rock into reactive moves and reactive effects a lot of times to do that. And in this case, we were playing 2 units of Vanguard veterans with Storm Shields. One of them was going to go with Cave and Strike to get his free up, down, and the access to advance and charge. The other one has a Hunter's Instinct jump pack captain. And usually what you'll see this army do is use that Hunter's Instincts Battle Round 1 or Battle Round 2, along with the captain free command point, to rapid ingress them really early on into the game and basically impact your opponent at the same time. Try to use them to clear space to put a Centurion Devastator squad or Inceptors into an aggressive spot. So you're able to kill something with the Inceptors, you kill something with the Vanguard veterans, and then you set up your future units like additional Inceptors, additional Centurions, and additional Vanguard veteran squads with Cave and Strike to impact on the subsequent turn. So I imagine that this game was actually much more difficult because what the Chaos Space Marine army cannot do is simply try to take pieces and then leave, because this Raven Guard army is so aggressive that if you leave the front line open, they're simply going to be able to place their Centurions in that spot and their Inceptors in that spot and use that to then shoot into the heart of your army. So you have to constantly be screening. Now, there are some effects that are pretty good against this. Things like having those rhinos is effective. The rhinos themselves, it's unlikely or impossible to lose the unit inside the rhino to the Centurion drop if the Centurions are coming off the table edge and shooting. It's difficult to actually get that unit inside killed unless your opponent can get both Centurions and Inceptors in the same spot and actually sort of commit that in and actually commit both of those units in a way that's beneficial for them. That is a lot of engagement, and you can hold the Obliterators in the back to try to clear those units out as soon as they rear their ugly head, and I imagine that that was a big part of the matchup, is essentially being able to counterpunch and kill the big bricks of Inceptors and Centurions when they arrive. So you could trade lighter units for them, but then feel good about being able to pick up those really powerful pieces. And the Shadow Mark Talon army does tend to fall apart a little bit once you lose the big ranged bricks, but it's usually okay as long as you don't lose the fight in the middle. However, with his powerful in melee as this Chaos Space Marine army, I imagine that it can fight the 20 Vanguard veterans, especially with judicious use of fights first, and things like the Nemesis Claw preventing defensive stratagems or interrupts from being used, which allows multiple units to come back from the Chaos Space Marine army and engage into one Vanguard veteran squad and just pick them up in the swingback. That ended up being a relatively close 68 to 80, beating an incredibly strong player who certainly could have made the top 16 all by himself. But that put Liam into the top 16. That 6th round was the shadow round, so only players who are in contention for top 16 had to play that round, but that qualified him for the top cut on the Monday of the event. Now, this was going to be single elimination, so if any of these players lost this game, they were out of the running entirely. Their tournament life was over. And in round 7, Liam got paired against Tau. This was Will B running a Mont-Ka detachment. Now, Will's list is incredibly unique. It makes enormous use of forward operators and pre-game movements, scouting on multiple units to put insane pressure on your opponent from the early game. However, I think that the Chaos Space Marine army does have the capacity to play its way out of jail or alpha strike situations like this Tau army is trying to create. Having things like the Warp Talons that will very trivially kill 10 Pathfinders, and this army had 30 Pathfinders in it, and then return into reserve so that you don't trade for that unit and you're able to do it again the next turn, means that the Tau player cannot simply run his models in front of your army and prevent you from moving. You're just going to lose those models and not get ranged attacks with the rest of his army. It works kind of like how the World Eaters matchup does, where World Eaters really want to set up for a turn where they can springboard into your army by using charge moves. The Tau player wants you to move forward and compete with him to fight in the center of the table. It's going to move aggressively. It's going to threaten a lot of scoring. And then if you take the challenge and you fight with it, it's just going to shoot you to death. So instead of using charges to reciprocate against aggressive enemies, it's just going to use its ranged attacks. However, again, the ability to interact with it without having to move into line of sight is a big deal. And there's very little way, essentially no way, that this army interacts with obliterators that are sitting behind a building. So if you use the obliterators to come in, indirect fire something off the table like a hammerhead gunship, for example, or you devilfish to open them up for the Pathfinders to get attacked, then you can move them out and take another round of shooting from those guys. That's going to be so much potential damage to this Tau army that they will most likely not be able to survive if they've already lost their shaft in the middle to Warp Talons and to Chosen early. While the Tau army does have a lot of very effective profiles into units like the Chosen, that unit is difficult enough to kill that it can kind of absorb a lot of the shooting from this army. And so if that is able to additionally get value and then pull focus from the rest of the army and force the Riptide Battlesuits and the Broadsides and potentially the Ion Cannon Hammerheads to fire into it to get rid of it, it's a lot of wounds. It has Armor of Contempt available. It has a damage blank available. It has an extra model that it can throw away in response to a big damage hit. And so that absorbs a lot of shooting, and then you can essentially counterattack from there and use that momentum to kind of catapult yourself to victory. That was a fairly close but a very high scoring 100 to 78 for Liam. That moved on to round 8, where Liam played against Andy Quascohen and his Star Shatter Arsenal Necrons. Now, the thing about this Necron army that's very unique is that it's very damage heavy. It doesn't have a ton in the way of really dangerous, solid midboard threats. So things like Wraiths or Lichguard bricks that we would often see to basically just stonewall the game in the center of the battlefield and allow its guns like the Silent King and its Doomsday Arcs to continuously shoot over the entirety of the game. However, it does trade very well with its opponent. Again, though, this Chaos Space Marine army is one that is trying as hard as it can not to trade. It's trying to take things for free. And so this Star Shatter Arsenal wants to force you to move forward to deal with its Locust Destroyers, Flayed Ones, Triarch Praetorians, its Triarch Stalker that's going to scout into the center of the table. But what this Chaos Space Marine army can do is simply say, I'm not going to play your game. I'm going to kill a bunch of those units, and then I'm going to either do it from out of line of sight or return my models into reserve, or mess up with your positioning by threatening reactive moves into my transports. And I'm not going to give you anything for the Doomsday Arcs to sink their teeth into. So you're able to clear out a lot of that trash early, and then you can kind of throw the army into the Doomsday Arcs and into the Silent King. And it's unlikely, while it does have a lot of this big, high multi-damage blast, it's unlikely it's going to be able to deal with like the Chosen and all of the Obliterators all committing at the same time. It's going to probably run out of resources in order to deal with all of that stuff all at once, and you're going to get multiple turns to activate into it. A lot of your profiles are pretty good into Doomsday Arcs because their toughness characteristic is low. Really high toughness characteristics can be very difficult for Chaos Space Marines because they don't have a lot of high strength weapons. However, it's a lot of strength 5 into toughness 9, which is pretty good for you. And once you get to grips with those units, you're actually able to knock them down pretty quickly. That one ended up being another relatively decisive 82-58 in favor of Chaos Space Marines. Now, that moved into the semifinals, and both of the semifinal and finals games were live streamed over by our friends at War Games Live. I'll put a link down in the video description to the VODs of that stream as well as to their channel down below. Now, this semifinal round was against Boris Mishev running Emperor's Children, and in this game, the combination of medium infantry sweeping that the Chaos Space Marines were able to bring to bear, in addition to the Warp Talons, were absolutely crucial. Now, Emperor's Children typically brings, and in this case, we were taking a standard build that included a lot of these tactical Marine style profiles. Infractors, Tormentors, Flawless Blades, Noise Marines, all T4, T5, relatively low wound count units. In all of these cases, these units are very susceptible to things like the opposing Noise Marines, which is a big deal, as well as Obliterator shooting, and, of course, the Warp Talons. And in this case, the Warp Talons were crucial. The game started with some skirmishing early on between the two armies. The Chaos Space Marines were able to use reactive moves to try to keep their pieces alive from aggressive melee threats from the Emperor's Children side. They counterattacked with a large brick of Chosen that were able to push onto the Emperor's Children side of the board. The Chosen are difficult to kill, so they absorbed a lot of punishment before they went down, forced a lot of the Emperor's Children to commit their resources to kill the Chosen unit, and that then allowed the remainder of the survivors as well as Obliterators to, and those Warp Talons, push forward, go up, clear a lot of the melee infantry that the Emperor's Children army brought out to play, put those Warp Talons back into reserve, and then use them in the late game to rapid ingress and harass the Emperor's Children backline. Emperor's Children tend to play so aggressively, and they have no screening potential essentially whatsoever because the army's it's all medium infantry focused. There's no light infantry or no, cultists or guardsmen equivalent in the entire codex. So the only thing they can do is push forward and try to get those units on the center objectives and hope that you don't clear them out in the backline. And it's a perennial problem with the faction, and those Warp Talons absolutely exploited it to depress the Emperor's Children scoring in the late game. Now, that gave Liam a pretty solid 65-42 win, bottom of the turn, and qualified him for the Grand Finals. In this case, he was up against Alexandra Sacco, who was playing Drukhari. Now, a similar kind of thing can happen in this matchup as well. Big deal is that the Chaos Space Marines have a lot of these kind of medium strength weapons, things like the multi-damage shooting on the Obliterators, the Noise Marines, and all of this is good at clearing out Drukhari transports to then expose the units inside to be eliminated by melee threats. Now, that forced Alexandra to play a little bit more defensively, and he ended up taking the first turn, which meant that Liam had bottom of 5 scoring, which was a big deal. And the Drukhari played things relatively cagey, kept stuff safe, and ensured that he wasn't going to lose any pieces early. But what that allowed the Chaos Space Marines to do is use their skirmishing units to kind of nibble away at the edges of the Drukhari army and push their melee pieces forward to depress the Drukhari score. That kept the game at parity until round 5. At that point, the Drukhari pushed everything forward. However, the Chaos Space Marines had enough remaining on the table. Their Predators were largely untouched. They did take some Dark Lance shooting, and they still had a lot of their melee pieces. They were able to push at the end of the game and clear out a lot of that stuff in order to win on round 5. It was a little bit of a defensive game from Drukhari, and that allowed the Chaos Space Marines to get the benefit in the late game, and that is what gave Liam the 3rd consecutive London Grand Tournament Championship. An absolutely phenomenal result for this army, and for a list that is incredibly non-standard. Not only are Chaos Space Marines not super popular right now, but Veterans of the Long War on top of that is also one of the most seldom played armies. That said, as I mentioned at the top, there's a lot of really powerful effects inside this detachment that you can abuse if you are a good player and you have excellent game knowledge. The ability to see when you're going to need to hold up things like Fight First or Warp Talon plays into Rapid Ingress, the use of Warp Talons to depress scoring in the late game was enormous and really showcased how a lot of these lesser played units in the hands of a phenomenal world-class player can do incredible things. But that is how Chaos Space Marines and Veterans of the Long War won Warhammer 40k's largest tournament. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Let me know down in the comment section what you thought about the results of this event. Remember to keep it classy. Thanks to Lighter Creatives for sponsoring this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.